How do we feel confident? We feel confident because the message satisfies the conditions or meets the criteria, two criteria which are important for a message that was given long time ago to still be authentic, to still be in its pristine, pure form. One criterion is the criterion of unanimity, ijma. All companions of the Prophet agreed that the Quran from A to Z is what is the message of God. So there was complete agreement. And this agreement then was transmitted to the Ummah in a manner that there was no gap. There was this uninterrupted continuity, which is what is known as tawatur. So, on the one hand, it was complete agreement of the first generation, and on the other, that agreement was transmitted in a manner that there were no gaps, not even of one day. It was uninterrupted. These two criteria, when they can be shown to have having been met in these two sources of the Quran and Sunnah, we feel confident that this is what the core message of Islam is. Like in the case of the Quran, similarly in the case of Sunnah, the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, prayed 5 times a day, for instance, and he was emulated by his companions, and that practice has, it never stopped. It has come to us uninterrupted. Alongside these two sources, there is a third source, which is a natural source. It came about naturally. The Prophet being the best example of religion, the one who gave the core message of Islam, the one who clarified to people what Islam was. There were many incidents that took place in his life. He led a life wherein obviously he had his own personal, private affairs as well. All of them were observed by his companions, some of whom, not everybody, not a vast majority, but a decent number of his companions, they transmitted, let the next generation know about them. Some people were informed about this information as well. Quite naturally, why would have it not been done? This third information, which is quite apart from the Quran and Sunnah, started getting transmitted from the first generation, some people belonging to it, to the second, and from the second to the third generation, until such time that in the 3rd century Hijrah, some 200 plus years later, there were some people who realized that people are speaking in the name of the Prophet and we don't know which information is reliable and which is not. So they undertook the task of trying to verify and find out the authenticity of the various claims. And as a consequence, we had these books of hadith, which are now another source of learning Islam. It's a long subject, and I've only this morning made a presentation at the University of Leeds on it. I'll just make a brief statement that this source, even though very important and valuable, it's a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. It cannot be considered as an independent third source giving us additional understanding of religion over and above the Quran and Sunnah. There are a number of reasons. I'll just mention one of them and move on. Had this piece of information, which got collected and expressed in the form of a number of books which were compiled, books of hadith, had it carried additional vital, important information about religion, then it should have been there available to all Muslims in the first 2 centuries as well. It was there in the first 2 centuries, available with some people, but only a few people. And a vast majority of the Muslim Ummah was unaware of a large component of this piece of information, this reservoir of knowledge. So, on the one hand, we value this aspect of learning, but on the other, we humbly emphasize that it's a footnote which has to be strictly seen in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. The second thing that I want to mention is that the Quran mentions two things about it. The Quran, the book of God, mentions or claims two things about its text. One, that the book of God enjoys or ought to enjoy the status of it being the ultimate criterion that should distinguish between right and wrong, that should decide ultimately and clearly what is religiously acceptable and what is not. The Quran also clarifies that the Quran is a clear book. It's not vague, it's not ambiguous, it's not talking in a language which people cannot understand. And when it comes to religious differences, differences are to be resolved by Muslims in the light of the Quran. The Quran calls itself Al-Furqan. It calls itself Mizan. It states that the Almighty has always been sending His books so that لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ فِي مَخْتَلَفُوا فِي, so that God's books decide, they give God's final verdict in matters they dispute in. That's absolutely clear, and that's one aspect of the Quran which is relevant to what I'm going to say. The other aspect of the Quran which is very important to always consider is that the Quran, of course, claims that it's God's book, but it also claims that it has no contradictions. And it goes on to say that the fact that the Quran is free of contradictions is a proof of the reality that is from God. So, verse 82 of Surah An-Nisa chapter 4 says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, do they not ponder over the Quran? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ, had it been from anyone other than Allah, لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا, they would have found therein a lot of contradictions, discrepancies. So, the Quran is the ultimate authority. That's point number one, which is in Surah Furqan, Surah 25, verse 1. It's in Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah number 2, verse 213, and many others. And the Quran claims that it has no contradictions. That is point number two. Point number three is that the Quran, the book of God, the ultimate authority, makes a clear statement that thou shalt not kill. You cannot kill. It's verse 32, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah number 5. You kill anybody, a human being, it is going to be considered as huge a crime as if you have killed the entire mankind. You save a soul from dying, and you have done such a huge virtue as if you've saved the entire mankind. Only two exceptions. There are only two exceptions. One, if a person kills another person, man qatala nafsan bighayri nafsin aw fasadin fil ard. If somebody kills another person, then the killer can ultimately get killed after the due course of law is allowed to take place. We'll have question answers immediately after the prayer. So that's the third thing. You cannot kill. Now, killing has taken place. It's mentioned in the Quran, mentioned in history. Why? Now that's what I am going to make an attempt to clarify. There is a law mentioned in the Quran very clearly, and it appears repeatedly. It's, to me, the most significant theme of the Quran. The law tells us that whenever the Almighty sent His messengers, Rasul, to a nation, and whenever they clarified the Almighty's message absolutely, unmistakably clearly, beyond a certain deadline, that nation was declared eligible to be annihilated. They were killed, mostly through natural calamities. But the Almighty's decision was that they are going to be punished in this very world. Their punishment will not be given while the Almighty is not going to wait for them to meet their fate in the next life. Why? Well, if you'll ask this question, I'll answer it, but I'm not telling you clearly that the Quran is making that statement in a number of its verses, and it goes on to tell us that the same fate was meted out to the nation that rejected the message of the messenger, last messenger of God, God's mercy be on him. I'll just mention two verses. One in Surah Anfal, the 8th Surah, verse 17, it tells us, talking about the battle of Badr, that, O people, companions of my messenger, falam taqtuluhum, you did not kill them, walakin Allah qatalahum. Instead, it was God who killed them. The reason why it was mentioned was that you cannot kill anybody. You've not been allowed to kill anyone. So it was God who killed them. Now, if there was any doubt, that doubt was removed in the next surah, Surah Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 14, wherein the Almighty says, yu'azzibhumullahu bi'aydikum. God is going to punish them through your hands. That is, it's going to be a very special occasion. God's decision to inflict His punishment, which He had been doing in the earlier cases through natural calamities, is going to happen through your swords in the case of these people. Why? Because one of the reasons is that in this case, the number of companions was much larger. In the case of many of the earlier messengers, there were a handful of a few companions who were accompanying them, and therefore the Almighty employed His other tools, like, as I said, natural calamities. Now, we have the mention of death for blasphemy as well as for apostasy. Let me take the case of apostasy first. Imagine Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, and other people who rejected the message of God even after it was communicated to them most clearly, beyond the deadline that the Almighty allowed them. They were eligible to be killed, and killed they were. If there were a few people who, to save their skins, said that we believe, and as a consequence they were spared, and later declared that they don't believe anymore, they met with the same fate, because the law that was relevant to the case of the nation that received the message directly from the messenger had to be applicable on them as well. As I said earlier, hadith has to be seen in the light of the Quran. This mention of death for apostasy is mentioned in hadith. The mention is absolutely correct, but the mention is an explanation of the law that is relevant to Risala. That is, the person, the nation that receives God's message directly and goes on to adamantly deny and reject it, they don't deserve to live anymore. So if somebody believed apparently to save himself and then went back on his belief, it would be the same fate that would be inflicted on him. It has got nothing to do with the later times when people have been allowed to have their faith, do whatever they want to. Obviously, if somebody does something which is wrong in the eyes of God, his punishment is waiting for him in the next life. But in this life, the Almighty is mentioned in the Quran time and again. وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wants to believe can believe, should believe, and whoever wants not to believe and deny and reject can deny. It's a free world where while on the one hand God's message is to be delivered properly, politely, intelligently, the other people have to be allowed liberty to choose whatever they want to. Some people might decide to believe, some people would be born to families which are Muslims, they might grow up and then they might decide about their own way later. This stipulation that is to be found in Hadith is not something that was meant to be law universally applicable for all times. That's one of the three subjects taken care of, madam. Now I come to the second one, which is blasphemy. The subject of blasphemy is mentioned in the Quran. What I'm trying to say is that the Quran mentions incidents wherein people committed blasphemy, but there is no mention of any punishment at all whatsoever. I am not saying that blasphemy was done by people, by those who rejected the message of God in Mecca, where the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, he did not have the authority to implement the law. Even in the case of Madinan surahs, the last 10 years of his life, when living in Medina, he had the authority to punish people for the wrongs that they were doing. The Quran does not mention any punishment. I'll give you a few examples. If you read the Meccan surahs, you will find that the Quran is actually mentioning the words of blasphemy that were uttered by some kuffar, those who denied the truth. You recite them. They're there in the Quran. Why? Because the Almighty wants to tell us that when you are going to try to speak the truth and let people know about what God's message is, there are some people who are going to believe, there are some people who are going not to believe, and there are some people who are going to react unreasonably. You've got to remain patient, you've got to continue to deliver the message, and do not be distracted by the reactions of others. Now I'll just mention briefly a few passages of the Quran which tell us that even in the Madinan society there were people who committed all sorts of acts which could be described as blasphemy. For example, in verse 104 of the second chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, the Almighty says, believers don't say Ra'ina, instead say Unzurna. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la taqulu Ra'ina. You see, these two words, Ra'ina and Unzurna, are like, for instance, we say in English, may I beg your pardon? Or you might say alternatively, could you kindly repeat? In Arabic, likewise, these two expressions were used. There were some hypocrites who used to come in places where the Prophet would be talking to his companions, and they would say teasingly Ra'ina in a manner that it would mean something else. It would actually, that expression was used by them to cause harm to the Prophet, to make a statement as if they were making fun of him. The Almighty said, don't use that word. Instead say unzurna, which is an alternative expression. My question is, why did God not say, and such idiot is making that expression so as to make fun of you? Just destroy him, kill him. Not at all. Instead, the Almighty says, just use another expression, so that the occasion, the possibility of misusing or incorrectly pronouncing the word doesn't arise. There is another passage in the Quran, verse 140 of chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, which if you read it along with verse 68 of chapter 6 and verses 57 and 58 of chapter 5, what you would find is that the Quran is telling us that in the Medinan society there were people who used to make fun of Islam. The society where the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was at the helm of the affairs, and there were people who would make fun of Islam. The Quran mentions it. The Quran has stated two things for the believer to do. One, when they are making fun of your religion, don't stay there. Remove yourselves from the place where it's happening, and when they stop doing it, you can come back. That's what the Quran says. Why did not the Almighty say that, you know what, just get rid of them, annihilate them? They deserve to be killed. No passage says that. The other thing that the Almighty has asked believers to do is to not make these people who are making fun of your religion your friends. Obviously, I cannot make a person who makes fun of my religion, even if he is a so-called Muslim, my friend. Some Muslims have erroneously understood from this passage that we cannot make Jews and Christians our friends. Well, the explanation that the Quran has given is that there were some Jews, some Christians, some other polytheists who used to ridicule Islam. And the Quran mentions what they used to do. When azan would be called for prayers, they would make fun of it. So the Almighty says, don't make them your friends. A third passage, it's in Surah Al-Munafiqun, chapter 63, verse 8. It says, it informs us that the leader of the hypocrites, Abdullah ibn Ubay, in one of the expeditions when Muslims went out of Medina, he delivered a speech to obviously his followers. And he said, لَيْ رَجَانَا إِلَى الْمَدِينَةِ, when we will return to Medina, لَيُخْرِجَنَّ الْأَعَزُّ مِنْهَا الْأَزَلِ, those who are respectable people, they are going to exterminate from Medina, expel from Medina those who are not respectable. The Almighty responded just by saying, وَلِلَّهِ الْعِزَّةُ وَلِرَسُولِهِ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ, it is God who enjoys respect, and His Messenger and the believers. وَلَكِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, and these hypocrites don't know. Why did not God say to believers that, look here is a bunch of idiots who are making statements which are intolerable, just go and kill them? Not at all. Now obviously you might ask me a very simple question, that if that is the case, then why is it that there are a large number of Muslims who say that the punishment for blasphemy is death?
Dr. Sir, I think Al-Mawrid it's time for Maghrib. Should we take a break here?
If you allow me another 10 minutes, it'll be over, and then we'll say our Maghrib and come back for question answer. But it's your decision.
Yes, sir. So is everybody okay with that?
No. The answer is that the reason why many people say that the punishment for blasphemy is death is that there were people who were killed because they committed blasphemy. You know? So that's what is reported. Now, that is why I had to go for that prelude. Those incidents are reported in hadith, in history, and I believe they are all correct. But what is their position? That has to be understood in the light of the Quran. Very briefly, I submit that the Almighty's punishment that had to be inflicted on the people who rejected the message that they received and they knew that it was from God, it was sent to them, inflicted upon them in 3 installments. The first installment of the punishment came in the 2nd century Hijrah, in the Battle of Badr, where 70 most prominent leaders of Quraysh were killed in that battle. The Battle of Badr is a unique battle in the history of battles, where only the generals were killed. No ordinary soldier got killed. It is because the Almighty decided that first those criminals who rejected the messenger, ridiculed him, opposed him, they have to meet with their fate. They were the ones who were blocking the process of others to understand religion and belief, and therefore they were the ones who were annihilated first. The last installment came in the 9th year of Hijrah, when in Surah Tawbah it was clearly declared that after the lapse of the sacred months, these polytheists are going to be killed. Kill them wherever you find them. That was the final installment of punishment that happened in the 9th Hijrah. In the intervening period, some people who became prominent in their rejection of God's message by committing acts of blasphemy and doing certain other things, they met with their fate in the light of God's law. The law was relevant to the times of messengers. The last messenger, God's mercy be on him, came, and like all other earlier messengers, it was decided by the Almighty that his nation, after it goes beyond a certain deadline, they are going to meet with the same fate which the earlier nations met. However, what happened to them was on the basis of a special law which was era specific, which had nothing to do with the general universal teachings of Islam. The universal teaching is that you cannot kill. The people who got killed were not killed by humans. God says, I killed them. I involved you in my project. That is why the Quran says, Falam taqtuluhum. You didn't kill them. Walakin Allah qatalahum. It is God who killed them. And this has been clarified on a number of occasions. So this is what takes care of the 2 issues of apostasy and blasphemy. We are left with only one other explanation that I have to make, and that is regarding adultery. The Quran mentions the fact that the punishment for zina, extramarital sex, is 100 lashes. It's mentioned in verse 2 of chapter 24. Az-zaniyatu waz-zani. These words in Arabic are used for all kinds of zanis, people, men or women, who get indulged in extramarital sex. It is not used for those who are unmarried and bachelors. It's used for both married and unmarried people. In the same chapter 24, verses 6 to 9, the Almighty tells us that if a husband accuses his wife of adultery, then the wife can get away from getting punishment by stating that I didn't do it, and by making a firm statement 4 times that by God I didn't do it, and a 5th time that may curse be on me if what he is claiming is correct. Now the Quran mentions she can get out of it, she can get away from being punished if she makes that statement. Which punishment? Well, it is referring to the punishment stated above in verse number 2. Furthermore, the Quran mentions in chapter 4, verse 25, that if slave girls who were not properly trained and groomed, if they get married and then they commit adultery, their punishment shall be half the punishment of those ladies who are who are not slave girls, who are emancipated, who are free. Obviously, there could be no half punishment for stoning to death. Half punishment can only be that of 100 lashes. Now, the question is that are you saying that there was no punishment of stoning to death applied by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him? The answer is that he did. But why did he do it? Well, that again has to be understood not in the light of the incidents that were reported by humans, but in the light of the Quran. That hopefully is the last statement that I am going to make. The Quran tells us in chapter 5, Surah Al-Mawrid, verse 33, that those who fight against God and His Messenger and cause mischief on earth, the Almighty mentions a number of punishments in such cases. And the first of the mentions is that their punishment is an yuqattalu, that they should be killed mercilessly. Those who create mischief on earth. What is mischief on earth? Well, there are 2 types of crimes. One crime is murder, and another is that there is an individual or a group of them who keep on murdering. They are serial murderers. There is a difference between the two. The punishment for murder is that the person is going to be just simply killed if the course of law establishes him to be a killer. But if there are people who have actually, through their evil designs, causing mischief on earth, and the ordinary individual, ordinary citizen, feels that his life is insecure, then such people are not ordinary killers. They have to be killed mercilessly according to the Quran. Likewise, there is one crime which is called theft, but there is another crime called burglary, robbery. There is a difference. A robber, a burglar, causes the property of individuals to be at their mercy, and people are in fear. For such people, the punishment mentioned by the Quran is even more severe. Likewise, there is one evil called extramarital sex. In Arabic, it's called zina. In English, obviously, there are 2 different words. But there is another crime whereby there are some people who rape, who make this evil act, popular in the society. They make it their business. They want to promote it. Now, this is mischief on earth. So the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, he administered the punishment of stoning to death in certain cases, which was actually on the basis of this verse, wherein those who cause mischief on earth have been suggested to be punished in a number of ways, and one of which is merciless killing, and stoning to death is exactly that. Because these statements that we get from hadith are reported by individuals, and they are not all consistent. There are different reports that we find coming from the different books of hadith. They need to be strictly seen in the light of the Quran to establish as to what is the context of those punishments. So what I'm saying is that the punishment for a person who is married and commits adultery is not necessarily stoning to death. The punishment for those who commit mischief on earth is merciless killing, one form of which is stoning to death. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, during his times when he investigated and established that there were some people who were guilty of mischief on earth, he required them to go through that punishment. Now, because it is mentioned in books of hadith, which was reported by individuals, and the reports, as I said, are different in different cases, the understanding has to be seen in the light of the Quran. I'll stop here and we'll say our prayers, and after the prayers I'll be available for your questions.
Okay. Sheikh Khalid, I have a question about the fourth case, which I thought you might also talk about today. The case of homosexuality, the death penalty for homosexuality. Through your research, what have you seen?
You see, there are 5 crimes for which the Almighty has mentioned punishments called hudud. That doesn't really mean that there could be no 6th, 7th or 8th offense, but he has chosen not to mention punishments about them in the Quran, which really means that he has left it to the Muslims of the times when such crimes and their punishments would be debated to decide what exactly should be done about them. Those 5 crimes are theft, fornication, adultery, mischief on earth, murder, and falsely accusing a decent, respectable person. As far as the others are concerned, it would all depend upon how the people at the helm of the affairs would choose to decide regarding them, and that decision could vary from one society to another. Whatever has happened in the later times will be taken into consideration as guiding incidents, decisions, but there is no clear mention in the Quran by the Almighty as to how other cases are going to be dealt with. There are people, and understandably, who suggest that such cases of obscenity are not very different from the case of zina, and therefore the punishment should be similar. There are others who say that it should be even more stern, and there are other perspectives as well. But as I said, the Quran has chosen not to speak about it clearly, and this is because it really has been left to the discretion of the people who are running the affairs to decide on the basis of what they think, in the light of the Quran and Sunnah, is more appropriate punishment.
Can I just ask the following question? I mean, to go from house arrest or just making life uncomfortable for people, as mentioned in the Quran, to capital punishment is a big jump. Because in the Quran, وَالَّذَانِ يَأْتِيَانِهَا مِنْكُمْ,
Yeah.
the punishment for that is house arrest.
Yeah, what is mentioned in Surah An-Nisa is the case of certain women who were indulged in fornication, adultery, and the expression, the wordings of the particular verse also suggest that there was another category, which was the category of women who were actually running brothels. They had made it in as a business, and they were asked to be confined to the four walls of their homes, and later on the Almighty declared punishments for both cases. In one case, when it was an ordinary crime of zina, it was 100 lashes, but for the ones who had gone ahead to spread this evil in the society by making it into a business, it was a more severe punishment, which I said was based on verse 33 of Surah Al-Ma'idah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I have interconnected questions. In fact, I will appreciate if you allow me time for dialogue. You have spoken about the punishment for apostasy in Islam, blasphemy, and adultery. Could you briefly tell us what were the punishments for these? Because these crimes existed before Islam came as a religion. So what were the punishments for these crimes before the advent of Islam in the surrounding societies or in the area itself?
I can only tell you that when Musa alayhi salam, Moses, again a messenger of God, he was going through the process of his prophetic mission. There came a time when people who apparently believed in him, people belonging to the children of Israel, they committed polytheism, shirk, by making a calf their god, and they created it and they worshipped it. And the Quran mentions it and the Bible explains it, that the people who got directly involved in that crime were killed. Ordinarily, there is no worldly punishment for shirk, for polytheism. You will preach, you will invite. But in this case, it were a group of, if you go by the figures of Bible, 3,000 people who were directly involved. And because they were Muslims, and after committing the act of shirk blatantly, they left their faith while the messenger of God, Musa alayhi salam, was there, and therefore they were subjected to the same punishment. Now, just let me mention that is precisely what I wanted to clarify at the beginning. That you see, the Quran is the final word, authority, criterion. It mentions the punishments which the Almighty has required, desired for all people who believe in the book to administer for all times to come. What events took place in the surroundings earlier? Well, if we have some reliable source, we look at it, but the fact of the matter is that compared to the Quran, there's no other source that would come anywhere close to reliability. Traditions were there, people would do different kinds of things, but there was no consistent policy. This was the final word given by the Almighty for these 5 categories of criminals to be dealt with, and what is mentioned in the history books is actually the application of what is mentioned in the Quran.
So let me get another question first.
I have a question, just a quick point on that. There is a lot of research on the Imyarites in Yemen. So the Nuwas, for example, converted to Judaism and he wasn't killed. He joined up with the Sassanid Empire. He lived in the 350. So there's a lot of research with archaeological digs of what you can see happened pre-Islamically. Question around your point about Abu Lahab and that the fact that they were killed was a contextual thing. I don't know if I actually like the morality of that, because the Quran is, Muhammad is Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Quran is for all of time. So if these actions were happening then, you can still apply your today's moral standards back then because you assume it's one continuous morality, it's an objective morality. So if someone is killed because, Abu Jahl was anti-Islam, he has a whole, Abu Jahl has a whole chapter about him. If we apply that today, we would think that's pretty crazy, right? Like, if Trump did that, we would stand up against him and think that's one of the worst moral things to do. And yet he's not doing that, he's actually banning specific people, and we're still not okay with that. How can we say that's a contextual thing since it fits in within traditional sources and within this objective moral framework?
It's the word of the Quran which clarifies this point beyond any shadow of doubt. That's what I attempted to clarify at the beginning as a prelude, and obviously some people had objections to it. I wanted to clarify that the Quran is the final word. The entire theme of the Quran, if somebody has read the Quran, he or she would know that the stories of the messengers, 6 in particular, Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Shuaib, Musa alayhimus salam. These stories have been mentioned repeatedly. Each story ending with a mention that after these nations rejected the messenger in a way that there was no possibility of them coming back, the Almighty declared that they don't deserve to live anymore. Now, you are questioning the morality of it. Well, I'll come to that point later. But what I'm trying to do right now is to establish that the Quran is absolutely clear that this is exactly what was meant to apply to this particular nation as well, which was right at the time when the Quran was being revealed, was receiving the message. And actually in one of these surahs, in Surah Al-Qamar, where it says, I think it says that Akuffarukum khairum min ulaikum. After describing those stories briefly, it says, are your rejectors any better than those who came before? In other words, how is it possible that the others who came before, whose stories are being mentioned, they met with those punishments? How can these be spared? And goes on to say, Am lahum baraatun fi zubur. Or is it that there is immunity mentioned for them in the scriptures? So, when you read the Quran as a book which is consistent in its message, it is unmistakably clear that it was a punishment that was not meant to go beyond the times of the Prophet, because it was a divine punishment. For a general principle, I've already mentioned, you cannot kill.
No, I'm not disputing that at all. I mean, the story of Khidr killed the child because God said that the child would end up becoming an unbeliever. So there are specific instances of this morality that apply to peoples and apply to young kids, or like in Banu Qurayza, anyone above the age of 15. These are specific moral judgments made at the time, and you can package them and say that's separate, but that is Amir al-Mu'mineen, that is the best of the best. And that is the moral framework that was applied to him and before him. So that is, can you not see how that's problematic if that's in the Quran? That, Khidr, for example, took a child, snapped its neck. That's a problem. Do you not think?
No, it is not a problem if you know that Khidr was an angel and God was telling a story about the fact that God, the Creator, gives life and takes back life. God sometimes causes kids to be killed, young people to be killed, and elderly people to also die.
So
it was not metaphorical, it was real. Khidr was an angel.
So the child was killed in that
by an angel, by God, not by a human. We humans are run by the law which is mentioned in the Quran, which says you cannot kill. If you kill, it is as if you've killed the entire mankind. So it was not a human being, it was somebody who was Abdum min ibadillah, one of the servants of God, and we know that God implements his decisions, many of his decisions, through his angels. So I think those exegetes who have assumed that Khizr was a human being, very humbly, I disagree with them. It was otherwise the message of the Quran would be inconsistent. The Quran, I again repeat, has clarified that, you know, when you killed some people in Badr, you did not kill them. And the reason why the Quran is saying is, if you allow me, there is a bracket, ellipsis, there's message in it. You couldn't have killed them. You are not allowed to kill them. You had no business to kill them. It was I who killed them. So if at all you have any doubt and you are questioning the morality of it, probably you might say that why did God choose to implement his punishment in this particular case differently? Well, for one thing, my answer is that as I mentioned the case of Musa alayhi salam, it wasn't that it was a unique case with the last prophet only. In the case of Musa alayhi salam as well, this punishment was inflicted, and it was absolutely clear that while the messenger of God was physically present himself, it was God's will that was implemented. It cannot be implemented in any other times. That's what I am trying to do. I'm trying to clarify that those Muslims who have generalized those incidents to apply to the non-believers of other times have committed a huge blunder, and they have done no service to the message of God, and they have grossly misunderstood it. That's what I'm saying. It would make the Quran blatantly contradictory, and the Quran challenges that it has no contradictions. Had it been from anyone other than God, you would have found therein lots of contradictions. That's what I'm trying to clarify.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Noor.
Right, so you mentioned about the punishment for adultery.
Yeah.
Now, in a number of your previous examples, you tried to say that there's some way you can contextualize some of the hadith or narrations that make statements which seem to be against the general spirit of the Quran. Now, in the case of the punishment for zina, as it's interpreted within the hadith, it very clearly and unambiguously makes it a general punishment. There's no qualification that it's some sort of extraordinary action taking place through the land. Even within the hadith, there are narrations claiming that there was supposedly a verse of stoning in the Quran. Therefore, the hadith is unambiguous in the general applicability of it. You cannot make a contextual case for that. So is there not the correct approach to see that perhaps the hadith literature really do need to be reassessed? It's not a reliable source, and there's no contextualization that can be made of those.
I think there have been two extremes amongst Muslims regarding the way they have approached hadith. Some people have taken hadith as the very word of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which needs no contextualizing. It is as if he is speaking right before us, and the words are exactly what he used. That is exactly what I was trying to say at the beginning, that it's a process that was undertaken by humans who, not every companion, Abu Bakr, one of the most outstanding Muslims, has only a few statements that he transmitted from the Prophet. Why? Because he had his own reservations with regard to this particular way of giving information. So, hadith is a source which relies on information which some people chose to transmit, and some very important other people didn't transmit. The Quran is the source which has been arranged by the Almighty to be fully preserved. Everybody unanimously agreed to it right from day one, and it has been transmitted with uninterrupted continuity. And the Quran declares itself as the criterion, ultimate criterion, on the basis of which all decisions have to be checked before declaring them religiously acceptable. When you say that, it is clearly mentioned in Hadith, well, what it means is that Imam Bukhari, who heard from Zubair, who heard from Abdullah, who heard from Abdul Rahman, who heard from Umar, and he heard from Abu Huraira, they are all, the chain is giving this information. Goodness me. When we know that these chains are there and they have been investigated by these scholars, and we respect them, what we get is information which on the one hand is useful, but on the other hand is not completely reliable as much as for them to be given the status of overriding the Quran. The Quran is making clear statements, and these pieces of information, they need to be strictly understood in the light of the Quran. And I think statements like these that the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him, clearly stated should be avoided, because on the basis of what we know about Hadith, the way it was compiled, I think this statement cannot be made. I think it's very careless to make that statement. All that we can say is, which many careful scholars say, that is how it is reported, aw kama qala, or whatever he said. We are not sure what he said.
Sorry, just wanted to clarify. You basically, if I understood you correctly, as you said, the punishment of death for apostasy and punishment of death for blasphemy is in the Hadith.
It is in
a reference for that, so I can look it up. Or?
Now that I can give to you, but right now I don't have it. But it's in authentic books of Hadith. But what I said was that I accept what is mentioned in books of Hadith, but they both have a context which we can clearly understand from the Quran. In the case of apostasy, those who believed to save their skins and then they disbelieved later, they would meet with the same fate as they deserved had they not believed in the first place. And those who committed acts of blasphemy in the period when they were declared to be eligible to be killed, because their act of blatant blasphemy actually declared that they have rejected the Prophet, and for them that deadline reached. The clear mention in the Quran in a number of passages wherein the Quran mentions that people went against the Prophet and spoke against him and ridiculed him, and yet nothing was done, is actually the general principle. That is the teaching of Islam.
That Jewish ruler Qas, I think he was killed in that.
Right. You see,
his car the other day in Medina.
So if you can just ask one question so that I can give other people a chance, because we don't have enough time. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to follow up on that apostasy thing, because just one thing.
Maybe if I can ask other people some questions, and if we've got time, we can come back. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much
We
for.
have two questions, the guy in front there.
Oh no, just one question.
You know, just to follow up. That's one follow-up question.
Just let him ask the question.
Thank you very much. My question is about Islamic punishment and that global trend about how they see for Islamic punishment, which is actually not implemented yet in the world as fully. They have a very soft corner, and they say how Islam can contribute in terms of giving Islamic punishment, like a death penalty on certain issues, in the way which globally people are agreeing upon. Even we cannot hit the child, even they do something very, very inappropriate or immoral. In this scenario, when everybody is held soft and being very rational about certain things, how Islam can help to make the save the world and remove the ambiguities about Islam, negative criticism about Islam in terms of Islamic punishments. I'm talking about.
Are you saying that the punishment cannot be implemented?
No, I'm saying it not get implemented, but how Islam can vast his spectrum to abandon the Islamic punishment or reduce the sensitivity of Islamic punishment.
You see,
in certain things. For example, if somebody do murder deliberately or commit fornication or do blasphemy or any severe crime, is there any way we can see or minimize the implementation of Islamic punishment?
I think we could.
you see, the kind of thought process that you have developed in the West now, it has its own history. It's a history, you allow me, which started from rejection of religion in general. Let's not get into it. They have a peculiar way of thinking, which to many people makes sense. However, for people like you, living in this country, God's expectations from you is that you must abide by their rules. You must follow the law that you have chosen to be a part of, because it is your promise, covenant that you have made with the system. When a society is going to run on the basis of Islamic principles, we'll tell the world at large that Islamic punishments are not a part of the system. They are going to be only implemented when somebody is going to violate the principles in a manner that the person will have no excuse left whatsoever. So, if, for instance, in a country where rich-poor gap disparity is huge, poor people are not going to be punished with the punishment of theft because of their desperate conditions. Likewise, if the society arranges itself in a manner that you have obscenity all across, and there are lots of temptations for people to do zina, the punishment for it is not going to be implemented until such time that the causes of it are eliminated. The one thing that must be borne in mind always is that punishments are one aspect of the Almighty's instructions. Another important rule that the Almighty has mentioned is that Muslims, whenever they are going to run their affairs, collective affairs, it's going to be on the basis of mutual consultation, which really means that you will have your representatives. How you choose them, select them, well, obviously it can be done differently in different societies, but right now we have a suggestion of democracy which is functioning. It has its own flaws, but obviously we need to move ahead to remove those problems. But once you have a legislative assembly where you have representatives of Muslims who would decide how to run their affairs, they will decide as to when punishments are going to be implemented, and obviously they will look at the ground realities as to whether the society is now in a position where the temptations towards committing crimes have been minimized, and therefore the stage has come when those punishments that were implemented in our days of glory should return. Because don't forget that those punishments were also not implemented overnight. There was time taken and people were trained, the society was made to progress morally, and then came a time when they were implemented. So when all this understanding is going to be put across and we will have discussion on how societies should function, hopefully we'll be able to convince at least a few people, if not everybody.
So just one question, so I can give a chance as well.
So Allah says in the Quran, أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول, and then he also says لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة. So in translation, obey Allah, obey the Messenger, and in the Messenger you have the best example. So you're always going to have to refer back to the Prophet, and this means we're going to have to use the hadith. Is that this is a question I'm asking you? Is that what you're saying? And if that's the case, does the discussion about the whole mutawatir, sahih, da'if, does that discussion only have to take place between the jurors, between the fuqaha, or does it have to, should it really be disseminated to the lay people, and do people have a responsibility of educating the Muslim community and in terms of understanding this? Because that's what a lot of confusion is coming across us, because it seems like a lot of knowledge has been, and just tell me if you agree with this or disagree, a lot of knowledge has been hoarded by certain people and is not available to the general community, and that means people are not able to form their own conclusions.
So are you personally kind of arguing for democratization of?
I'm not arguing for anything. I just asking.
You see, the verse, oft repeated verse, Atiyullah wa Atiyu Rasul, doesn't mean that you obey Allah, which means you obey the Quran, and you obey the Messenger, which really means you follow Hadith. It really means obey Allah, that is, obey the Messenger. Which really means, which the Quran clarifies, that God Himself doesn't come down from the heavens for Him to be obeyed directly. In order for Him to be obeyed, He has sent His Messenger. So obey God, that is, obey the Messenger. So obeying the Messenger means following the message, the religion that he has brought. And I've mentioned that if you look at the manner the Almighty Himself has arranged for that message to be transmitted, it has been done in a manner that there are two sources which have been made authentic. You don't need any detailed knowledge of Islam for that. They are there for every ordinary Muslim to know. That the Quran is preserved, the Sunnah like prayers, fasting, etc. are preserved. The third source of Hadith, which we are thankful to many people who on their own volition, it wasn't something which was binding. Had it been binding, everybody would have transmitted everything else, everything that they saw. I can assure you that a good part of the life of the Prophet, may God mercy be on him, has not been transmitted. I give you an example. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu migrated with the Prophet, and these were the only two people who migrated together. And they spent something like 7 days and 7 nights together. What happened, we don't know. Why? Because Abu Bakr chose not to mention anything. God mentioned more about it in the Quran, but he didn't do it. So it's a process that happened naturally, and it's a process that involved humans. The job task done by these people is brilliant, but allow me to say, we have exaggerated its significance. It has to be placed in its proper position, which is as a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. I mentioned something and I just want to repeat it. Imagine in the first 200 years of Muslim history existence, the most glorious period of our times, this hadith literature was available to only a few Muslims. Had it carried important, critical, crucial part of Islam, then what we are saying is actually bringing a blame to God and His Messenger, that a very important part of religion was not available to the people who were the best example of Muslims. So I think let's be reasonable and fair in giving the right position to hadith. It should neither be brought down and completely ignored, nor should be elevated to a place wherein it is overriding the Quran. Right now I can tell you the manner some Muslims are behaving, they're ignoring what is mentioned in the Quran. They're just relying on hadith in their understanding of the Quran, in the understanding of religion. What I am pleading for is that hadith should be placed in its position, and we should follow the instructions of the Almighty, wherein He says, Ya Ahlal Kitab, La Taghlu fi Dinikum Ghayr al-Haq. O people of the book, don't exaggerate in your religious matters unfairly.
Thank you so much for your thought. There are a couple of clarifications. So when you're talking about a period of time around the time of a messenger and a message to a community of people in which special punishments and special requirements were made of that people, and beyond that time, if they didn't obey, if they didn't accept the message, then they were open to be killed. Right? Can you provide any more clarification on what that timeline looks like, where it's been mentioned in the Quran? Because as a layperson reading the Quran, I've never really drawn that distinction. It's never been very clear to me reading it, although I do see some context-specific passages in the Quran, like the references to slavery, for example, whereas today that would not apply. It applied then because it was a practice then. And the second thing is, can you provide a little bit more clarification on what mischief translates as? Because I can see that being open to abuse by people who want to cause mischief. And saying, well, that practice looks like it's mischief to me, so I'm going to kill this person or kill that community group of people, especially where people are politicizing their interpretation of Islam.
Let me take the second question first. You see, no matter how mischief is defined, it's something which needs to be defined by the rulers. It cannot be something that an ordinary Muslim or a group of Muslims can do on their own and take the law into their own hands. Mischief on earth is the attitude and behavior, evil behavior of an individual or a group of them that causes the lives, the property and the honor of the ordinary people to be at stake, to be at their mercy because of the kind of fear that they have created. Ordinary crimes, I'm saying comparatively, ordinary crimes have actually been mentioned in the Quran with their punishments, so that the punishment for zina, extramarital sex, the maximum punishment is 100 lashes. The punishment for theft is amputation of hand, the maximum punishment. Likewise, other crimes. In the case of murder, in some cases, the person who kills is going to get killed. However, the punishment mentioned in verse 33 of Surah Al-Ma'idah chapter 5 is that those who cause mischief on earth, and it is preceded by a statement, those who fight against God and His Messenger, وَيَسْعَوْنَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا, and they cause mischief on earth. So what it means is that there is a group of people who, because of their evil designs, evil ways, they have caused mischief, fear to be there in the society because of their existence. It's not a isolated act of some offense. It's a continuous, ongoing process which they are undertaking. So there is a big difference between the two categories of crimes, and therefore the manner they are to be punished. When you say that, does the Quran clarify well enough the fact that there is a punishment which was meant only for those who were the immediate addressees of the Messenger? Honest to God, I think a careful reading of the Quran gives a picture that this concept has been clarified more than any other. You see, either the Quran, I'm trying to help understand by giving an assumption, is sometimes talking unnecessarily about certain matters. The story of Nuh alayhi salam, was good enough if it was to be mentioned only once. What was the point in mentioning, repeating it over and over again? Why? People do ask. Why does the Quran repeat itself so many times? The answer is that let's first try to understand the theme of the Quran. The Quran from A to Z is a description of the saga of the messenger, whereby he followed the Almighty's instructions to implement for the last time in the history of the world the emergence or the happening of a mini day of judgment. You see, these punishments were actually a reminder that there is going to come a day of accountability. It is not just a theoretical, philosophical presentation, it's a reality. And in order for the reality to manifest itself clearly, it was actually done practically and implemented. This happened in the case of only a few nations who received messengers in their midst. And this happened for the very last time in the case of the last messenger, God's mercy be on him. And the Quran is describing the whole mission from beginning till end, guiding the messenger, answering to the questions of those who were the addressees, telling them that they are going wrong, warning them that the punishment is going to come very, very soon, telling the messenger and his followers to be patient and patiently wait for that punishment. To me, honest to God, this mention is so clear in the Quran that probably there is no other theme which has been clarified quite as clearly.